Okay, thank you, everyone. Today's presentation on the Open Ed Week agenda for LibreText is a discussion around our machine translation effort. So the last half a year, we've been pursuing efforts in order to try to expand the scope and impact of the LibreText corpus to include students from non-English speaking countries. And that was something that we've been pursuing for a while, but things rapidly scaled up thanks to technology. So I have a small agenda for today's discussion. One is a general overview of the LibreText and the power of centralization. If you're familiar with the LibreText and the discussions that I typically give around LibreText, this will be pretty straightforward, repetitive to what you've seen before. Then I'm going to transition into three steps that we've been pursuing in terms of addressing this global impact. One is to build a global OER platform. The other one is to implement a polyglot engine in order to facilitate mass translation, mass machine translation to be specific. And lastly, to establish a network in order to facilitate editing of the content that's created from mass translation out there. So who am I? I'm a professor of chemistry at the University of California, Davis. I've been here since 2005. My research focuses on ultrafast laser spectroscopy, photoactive biological systems. Basically, I have a big laser system that shoots laser pulses into biological systems in order to look at fast dynamics on the order of femtoseconds to picoseconds, so 10 to the minus 15 to the minus 12 seconds. So very fast. I'm the founder and director of the LibreText project. It was founded in 2008 as the ChemWiki and then expanded in scope in several blocks since then. I'm the co-chair of the UC Davis Aggie Open, which is an OER program to facilitate OER on my campus. I'm an adopter of OER, I'm an adapter of OER, I'm a creator of OER, and I'm a curator of OER. And I emphasize these things in order to point out that when I do respond to questions and conversations, I wear different hats in order to be able to address those. And the second one is I have a very practitioner-oriented perspective regarding OER and where OER needs to go. And that complements other perspectives in the field, for example, a librarian-oriented perspective or a publisher-oriented perspective that's out there. I have not used a commercial textbook in a class for the last decade, about 5 to 6 different unique classes. So as an instructor, it became clear to me that I was taking part of a system that was making textbooks unaffordable solution. So by assigning students expensive textbooks, that was having a detrimental impact on my educational mission because over a quarter of the students were not purchasing the textbooks in their class for a variety of reasons, and cost was the primary reason that the students had expressed to me. So that was what precipitated the founding of the LibreText project, or then ChemWiki. Over the years, we've received support from a variety of different agencies and a variety of different organizations. Currently, our support comes from the U.S. Department of Education and from the California Education Learning Lab. But we have also received sizable support in terms of hosting from NICE CX1, which handles our wiki-based infrastructures for our libraries. And as I'll be mentioning, we've partnered with Amazon cloud systems in order to be able to do the mass translation efforts that we've been discussing. So why do people pursue OER in general? There are two general gists, at least the way that I view it, is people are interested in making a textbook of the people, which is making affordable textbooks for people to be able to capitalize and use without having to redirect funds that would be better used for other purposes, for example, for food or for housing. Instead of going into commercial publishers' pockets. And the other one is to build a textbook of the future. And this is to build something better than the conventional textbook that's out there. The textbook of the people involves generating something that's free from external control, free from external financial issues, free to distribute, free to edit and curate, free to customize. And these are all critical components that underlies the open aspect of OER. To make a textbook of the future, I don't know what the textbook of the future is going to look like because it's the future, but I do know that it's going to be a textbook of technology. And it's going to be a textbook of interoperability, and it's going to be a textbook that will involve engaging between the content in the textbook and the students. that are using that textbook. It's a textbook that will involve advanced pedagogy, that will capitalize on the technology and understanding how to maximize the utility of that technology, but there's no reason we can't do both. And that's what OER provides us the opportunity in order to be able to do. Now, this is an older survey. I should be updating it. This is from then the Babson Survey Research Group, now called Bayview, and they identified reasons for faculty not adopting OER. And there are a handful of reasons. I typically classify it as quantity, quality, and ancillary materials. But one of the key points in order to emphasize here in this list is that there's a difficulty in order to find OER. And this was identified back in 2016, and in some cases it's gotten better. In other cases, it's actually worse, depending upon how you view these things. And I'll talk about that momentarily. But before I go into it, I want to discuss our mission. So this is the mission statement that I like to give out in these presentations. We're implementing a community-built platform for the construction, curation, adoption, and adaption of OER that's comprehensive and can be curated at multiple levels. Each of these bolded words is particularly important in order to define our goals and the way that we actually view how we operate. Each of the terms that are in the parentheses are particularly important in terms of the mechanistic application of what we were doing. So we're a platform that's designed around community, which means that we capitalize on what other people have done and capitalizing on the sharing is caring model in OER. So that means anyone who can contribute, whether it's a faculty member, it's a student, it's an external expert, we welcome them with open arms and facilitate their meaningful contribution to the corpus that we're building. OER, we can define for a variety of different, spend a lot of time in order to define. I'm just going to, for the sake of this conversation, say it means free or sort of free, open access, but it's the formal definitions are tied into open licensing and such. We follow a comprehensive no gap left behind policy, which basically means that while we were born out of chemistry, we have an interest that's across the board of all academic fields. That also means that we follow a no tech left behind policy, which means capitalizing on existing technology or emerging technologies that we integrate into our platform so that students and faculty have access to more than just a conventional text-based or web-based interface in order to augment their educational experience. And that also means that we follow a no person left behind policy. So adequate education of our students means that we don't leave any students behind, irrespective of any sort of issues, whether that's a failure of students in order to fold into and into the and into the comprehensive nature of the content for diversity, equity, inclusiveness aspects. It means engaging students from a culturally responsive pedagogical approach. It basically means that if students have accessible issues, we implement the technology in order to facilitate their effective usage of our platform. And lastly, the content that we have is curated, which means it's a dynamic content, and that the corpus that we're creating is a living library. And this is a key component that separates us from other platforms out there, because we're not just a publishing platform where the end game is just to publish what's being created. In fact, we think that's the start of the game. Being in academia, that is the way that we view this stuff. We need to constantly update, constantly curate, and constantly move content forward, whether it means to address issues, address bugs, or just being able to introduce greater inclusiveness into it. And that means that the development team and the greater curation teams built around the LibreTexts project facilitates curation efforts. So we take on a lot when we bring content into our platform off of here. So I will mention that this week is our 15th year birthday, and we've been around the block a few times, first as the ChemWiki and then as the LibreTexts project. I will also mention that this month we are celebrating our 1 billionth page view that we've delivered. So we've served a lot of students over the last 15 years, and we're very excited with where the next 15 years is going to be looking for us. So let's talk about fragmentation. The OER universe is fragmented. It's fragmented for a variety of reasons. When I say fragmented, I mean that you can find content in a variety of different sources. For example, the open textbook library, well, most of the time you can't find, it doesn't have, its focus is predominantly as a referatory, so it gives you links of where things are, so it's more of a library guide than a true library. OER Commons is also more of a referatory than a repository, having similar capabilities in order to look and find content in various spots on the internet. OpenStax hosts its own content. Merlot is a referatory with some repository capabilities. OpenSUNY, Galileo, OpenOregon, NOVA, BC Campus, eCampus Ontario, Alberta, Sailor, Hawaii, CSU, Oregon State University, and I really should have OpenCourseWare on here too, so I'm sorry, Court, I will update that in a moment. And there are loads of other projects that are out here. So the key point is that you could find OER in a wide variety of different places on the internet, and sometimes that OER will disappear. And fortunately, the Internet Archive can provide some mechanism in order to be able to address that. But the issue is that because things are distributed in a variety of places, and I should also mention that there's a load of OER on individual faculty computers if they were to understand that they can apply open license to the content. So there's a wealth of content out there, and finding it can oftentimes be quite a painful process. What we were doing from the very beginning was consolidating, integrating existing OER, capitalizing on the O in OER, and bringing it into our platform, standardizing the content and making it essentially a bigger bucket of Legos. And that is convenient because when an instructor comes in and they want to remix content, they can pick and choose content very easily and bring it together so they don't have any issues. For example, if you have a block that, if you have a box of Legos, Duplos, Lincoln Logs, and constructor sets, you wouldn't be able to convert those things easily within each other or even at all. We pre-digest these things, put it into a single standard within our platform, and make it so that instructors, when they want to create their own book, they're largely limited, hopefully, once the size of the bucket gets big enough, by their own imagination. And that is a central point of how we focus. So we both build content, facilitate content through our LibreNet partners, and also integrate, or what we refer to as harvest, existing OER content into our platform from a wide variety of sources, whether they happen to be handmade notes, websites, LaTeX source, PDFs, or other platforms out there. So that provides a centralized infrastructure. It standardizes content. It makes content interconvertible. You can, from that, build easy collections or user books. It makes extreme flexibility off the case, and it provides a massive capability of curating the content because, again, it's centralized in order to be able to do that. Now, there are a handful of other components that are value added to the way that we've actually discussed this, and I'll be discussing this later on today in a presentation specifically dedicated to editing. If you're interested in that, you can take a look at our blog at blog.libretext.org in order to find our dates. So the outcome of what we've been building over the last several years is an ecosystem of courseware, an ecosystem of independent technologies in order to address a handful of different features that we need, again, from a practitioner's perspective. And that ecosystem we refer to as the LibreVerse. And the LibreVerse has at its core the libraries, which is our living libraries that I talked about before. They're 15 interconnected, independently operating wikis. And we chose wikis because it was the best technology for large-scale collaborative construction efforts. Think of Wikipedia. It was the best technology 15 years for doing that. It's the best technology now for doing that. And that's going to be particularly critical as we start to expand into the global realm for the machine translation and eventually human translation of the OER corpus that we have. I already gave an overview of the LibreVerse yesterday, so I won't go into much behind it other than arguing that there's a set of ancillary technologies around the libraries in order to provide value-added advancements to the content that's stored in the libraries. This includes a homework system, ADAPT, which we'll be discussing in detail tomorrow, a Jupyter Notebook system, which gives us the ability to embed executable code into our pages, a range of other JavaScripts that we have stored, for faculty to use a learning analytics infrastructure in order to evaluate how students use the resources, whether it's the homework system or the textbook, in order to give actionable information on evaluating the efficacy of the book or evaluating the pedagogy of that book. A comments conductor technology, which is used as a project management tool and a cataloging system, especially for our consortium members, forums, and for communications. And we have a bot server, which is designed in order to do large-scale curation efforts across all our site, because when we have 500,000 pages of content, manual translation, let me phrase that, manual curation of the content can be a very daunting process. So getting back to distribution. Centralizing the content into a single source provides us the opportunity in order to facilitate augmented distribution. This is reflected in the number of page views that we've delivered. Again, we distribute somewhere in the order of 850,000 pages of content per day. But there are other mechanisms that we use in order to distribute content. We can distribute PDFs of our content. We can embed our content into learning management systems. We can generate print files that can be uploaded to Lulu or uploaded to Amazon's print infrastructure. We will have EPUB export of all the content that we host soon. We went through one version of that, and now we need to update that to be a little bit more flexible. We can generate physical books of any of our content by processing and sending it off to Lulu Express. That's almost it's not just a print on demand, but it's at almost operating at cost. We can upload our libraries into Raspberry Pi boxes, so LibreTexts in a box that can be used in order to access our content completely offline. This was designed in order to address countries that had limited internet capabilities. However, the COVID pandemic exposed to us that there were lots of populations in America that had limited internet access, whether it's due to infrastructure issues or due to just financial issues in terms of being able to tap into the internet infrastructure that's out there. We delivered a lot of PDFs to date, over 1.5 million, and we've generated over 4,000 physical books and growing greatly through our bookstore. I will mention the LibreNet briefly because it plays a role with the long-term aspect of our translation efforts. So the way that our infrastructure is set up right now is that we have a central repository, a central LibreVerse infrastructure, and individuals can tap into it directly. So it's a centralized approach for doing so. Individual campuses or districts can join a LibreNet, which is our sustainability model, where they can actually capitalize and on the LibreVerse and customize content in a variety of different ways for their specific use. However, we are pursuing a more decentralized approach to complement the centralized approach, or a mixture between the two, in order to be able to facilitate a greater expansion of our efforts. And it's especially useful in order to address individuals or campuses that have a desire in order to have stronger control over their content, rather than having it localized on our system. Part of that is with what we're going to be releasing soon, which is a Project Solo, which is sort of a standalone mini LibreNet. Mini LibreVerse, and it provides opportunity for countries that have a need in order to have their own open source technology hosted on their own servers in order to be able to run and operate and host our content, along with several capabilities of the LibreVerse on themselves. So that will start to build a network that's distributed in order to facilitate communication and transfer of content from one node to another node of this network that doesn't involve the mothership, the main LibreVerse infrastructure. This right here, again, this infrastructure that we're introducing is called Project Solo in order to be distinguished from here. And I wouldn't be surprised that people are going to hear more about that, because it's going to be a core technology for some of the expansion efforts that we're going to be doing, both from global perspective and also from the K-12 perspective. Okay, so that's a general overview of the LibreTexts project and some features associated with the LibreVerse and where we're going. So how does this play a role with our global impact? Well, I mentioned that we will be serving our 1 billionth page this month. if you look at the traffic of that we've been serving over the last 15 years, approximately 50% of our traffic is outside the United States. So we already have a global impact in terms of faculty, students predominantly identifying content and reading it and consuming it, but they're consuming it predominantly in English, which may be perfectly fine for many countries and many students in the world. But we knew that we wanted to be able to expand the scope of what we were being able to do in order to address students where English is not the official language or lingua franca, or actually a proficient language for students in order to be able to read in. And that meant we needed to have different languages of the content that we had. So in that case there, we started several years ago by introducing a non-English language library, and this was the Espanol library, and this was the language that had the best impact in the United States, so it was easy to justify it within our financial support from the state and federal grants. So we built this independent library. Again, you can view it if you want at espanol.libretext.org. It's entirely in Spanish, and we took existing content that, if it was in Spanish, we harvested it and curated it in the same way that we did with the English library. But we also took existing OER in English that we then translated it into the foreign language. That was a very time-consuming process. It was also because we use students, not significantly costly, but if we were to start to scale that up with professional translators, it'd be a very expensive process in order to do this manual translation. The benefit from that is that you have a human that's able to review very carefully and bring things up to near perfection that's out there. So we did this for the last handful of years, and the library that we generated was relatively small. Let's say somewhere in the order of 1,000 to 1,500 pages that were out there. However, each page attracted 4 times higher impact and traffic, that is, than the English version of that page in the other library. So that demonstrated to us that there was a strong need for at least Spanish OER that's out there. And as I think many of us would argue, there's a strong need across the board outside of English. So we can look at the numbers in order to do that instead of look at the anecdotes. So this is just arguing that there's about 200 million tertiary, so post-secondary education students in the world today. It's doubled since, or close to doubled since the turn of the century. And the growth has been great in Latin America and Spanish-speaking countries. So there is growing need in order to have Spanish OER that's out there. However, if you actually were to expand that scope to not just Spanish and look at all the students in the world, if you just argue that 95% of the world doesn't speak English as the first language and 75% doesn't speak English at all, that means that there's a significant number of students out there that could capitalize on the OER that we have curated, that's hosted in our corpus, but don't do so because it's in a language that they're unable to conceive with. So we built this infrastructure that's out there. I'm going to skip over this slide here and just show a little bit of the traffic that we had here. So we had 8 books. This was up until last summer. We had about 1,500 pages of content. And as you can see here, we've been growing quite rapidly, at least up until last summer, somewhere in the order of 2.5 million page views since we started this in 2019. So there's a strong need out there. This right here showed the traffic for the Espanol library, which focused predominantly, as people would not be surprised, in Spanish-speaking countries, especially in Latin and South America, Mexico, Colombia, the United States, Ecuador, and such. So the issue that we had here is this was a very slow, time-consuming process. So we can either take a long time in order to do it in this way, or we can get a sizable amount of investment of funds in order to be able to parallelize this with a lot of humans in order to translate that. However, in the last few years, as many of us in academia have noticed, especially in the last few months, there's significant advancements in AI, artificial intelligence, out there. And one of the manifestations of artificial intelligence is machine translation. The ability in order to take content in one language and convert it to the other using a machine that is able to facilitate that. Now, I am not an expert in this in any way whatsoever, but I've certainly been able to recognize that the quality of machine translation has advanced a lot over the last decade. It's out there. The key component that we have off of here is that machine translation can operate at scale. It can operate without human involvement, and therefore it doesn't involve the financial investment that's off of there. So we pursued two types of machine translation efforts in order to address making content in other languages. So the first one is real-time translation. This is available on all of our libraries. On any of the pages, we have an option right below our logo that can, right now it's reflected in only one language, which we have Ukrainian, that individuals can flip on a switch in order to take a page from English into Ukrainian. Like, for example, this right here is an inorganic chemistry text that we created as part of the Open Textbook Pilot Award that we received from the U.S. Department of Education. And this is the version in English. If we selected on this thing into Ukrainian, it would then convert it into Ukrainian. Now, machine translation isn't a human translation. It does it instantly, which is great, but it's not perfect. Now, the quality of translation depends upon the nature of the language that you're dealing with. So if it's a Romance language or a Germanic language, an Indo-European language, even though Ukrainian is also Indo-European, but especially in Spanish, it can be quite good. In languages that are far outside of Europe, the translation of English into those languages is particularly poor. So in Spanish, it has a quality of somewhere in the order of 95%. In other languages, for example, Hindi and Swahili and such, it's somewhere in the order of 60 to 70%. That being said, it still provides a great reference point in order to be able to build upon. And many students can comprehend quite nicely 90% perfection, or even 70% perfection, because 70% perfection is better than 100% perfection of 0 pages. And that's the underlying gist of what we were doing here. So that was real-time translation, which means that individuals can click the button in order to be able to access that. Its benefits is that it's instant. It's updated in the sense that when we update the content in English, if a person flips the real-time translation, it does the translation of that updated content. We implemented several translation engines in order to pursue this, but Amazon is the one that we've been pursuing most aggressively because they're the ones who've had the greatest interest in expanding our scope. The drawbacks that we have for real-time translation is that it provides no search engine optimization for non-English users. So in other words, a student doesn't have the ability to do a Google search in order to find the page, for example, this page right here in their language, because it doesn't exist in their language until the student actually flips the switch that's right on here. So it means it doesn't show up in any search engine results that are out there, and that makes it difficult in order to capitalize on the centralization aspect of the LibreText project. It provides no methods for curation of that translation. Doesn't let us improve the quality of that translation. It can provide then an inconsistent user experience out there, and it doesn't provide a easy export option that folds into all the components I talked about before in terms of PDF or embedding the learning management systems or making a physical books or other mechanisms that people may want in order to export these things. So we wanted to be able to pursue something that had a bit more utility off of that, and that was mass translation. Non-real-time translation. So in other words, we want to take our corpus of content and convert it into another language completely and host it in a separate library. To that end, we pursued expanding in the Espanol library, and then we introduced a new library for Ukrainian. This was prompted by the war in Europe. And you can review both of those independent libraries right here with the URLs that are out here. So these are completely independent libraries from the English libraries. While we had been working with Espanol for a while, we had no experience. The Ukrainian library was completely new to our endeavor. And the approach that we did was we had 500,000 pages on our content, on our corpus. but we selected 100,000 pages of our central corpus to work with. And we implemented an infrastructure, what we call a polyglot engine. This is all open source. It's based on Amazon Lambda. The details even are sort of sketchy for me to be able to address. It's open source. You can find the code on GitHub if anyone's interested in that. And the key point is it provides a mechanism in order to take content from one page in English and create that page and convert it into a foreign language. We have access to 80 different languages within Amazon, not just Ukrainian and Spanish. And this procedure here was optimized over several months. This provided a lot of convenience, especially when coupling with Amazon, because they had a very effective translation service. It was very cost effective, even though they were fortunate in order to give us the support in order to do this without us investing money into it. The quality was reasonably good. We had some familiarity with the platform because we use Amazon Lambda for other aspects of our LibreVerse, especially for our Adapt homework system. Although it's not, other providers are equally available. If we want to be able to couple into Google or other translation services, we can implement a similar system in order to facilitate that. When we actually went through this and went through the effort off of that, it takes approximately 30 minutes in order to process the translation of one book. In this case here, this is a book that has, I think, approximately 400 pages. This is concepts in biology from OpenStax. It goes through several different steps in order to be able to translate this. This is asynchronous. We submit a book and 30 minutes later we get the book, and the cost, if we were to pay for it, is about $30. So we could take a book and use machine translation. That's the book that specifically has to be stored on the LibreText infrastructure, and we can convert it into another language that's out there. So approximately $30,000 to $40,000 for 100,000 pages of content is what it costs in order to convert the library into another language that's out there. So we did that for those two languages. Now, the Ukrainian library, like I mentioned, was new, but the Spanish library was already pre-existing. And this just shows the traffic that we had before on the Spanish library, like I mentioned. And at this point in last November is when we did the machine translation effort. And at that point, it scaled it up by a factor of 4. This is the dip over Christmas break, which students don't study. And this is still growing today. So this showed clearly that we had a massive impact in terms of the machine translation out there, predominantly in Latin America, Central and South America, although we also had growth in Spain that's out there. Again, we did the same thing for the Ukrainian library. Ukrainian translation was a little bit poorer, especially in the sciences than in Spanish, but it did provide a mechanism in order to move forward with what we wanted to do. We had extra credits left over, so we wanted to be able to explore some of the other languages than Ukrainian and Spanish. So we introduced so we did the mass translation on a handful of books, approximately 20 different books in 6 different languages, in French, Portuguese, Swahili, Arabic, Hindi, and Chinese. And that was just basically testing out the quality that we had here, and more importantly, scaling this thing up to the next step, which I'll talk about in a moment. It's just probably a test bed in order to be able to generate what can we do with this machine translation, especially if we get the support in order to be able to scale this this effort up broadly. I mentioned this before, but I'll mention again, all the code that we create, it can be found on GitHub. So you can, if anyone has a desire, they can grab, commandeer, and rewrite and reuse for their own purposes. The machine translation infrastructure for Amazon is really quite easy in order to use. So what have we done? So we took hundreds of thousands of pages of content in English, and we converted it into hundreds of thousands of pages of content in other languages using machine translation. It took several days of paralyzed effort in order to be able to do, and it wasn't terribly costly, even if we didn't have the support of Amazon behind us. The issue that we have here is that machine translation is not as good as human translation. Like I mentioned before, Spanish is really good. Hindi has few issues with it, and I'm sure many of the other languages that come from more less colonial European languages will have even poorer translation out there just because of the poorer training associated with that machine translation model, at least currently. So we want to be able to augment that, to improve that. Now, part of the efforts of OER is to establish a distribution infrastructure. Now, that's what the LibreText does, or LibreVerse does, as a centralized repository for people to be able to find and to distribute there. We want to be able to facilitate that in other countries, and part of that involves also growing an adoption network. Now, a faculty will not adopt content that is not sufficiently translated, sufficiently good for them. And that means that we want to first, before facilitating adoption, to facilitate human translation. So taking content from that's been translated via the machine translation mechanism and getting it up to 100% quality. So you can think of this as an American football game, right? We've basically used machine translation to get the football all the way down to 10 yards before the end of the before the end zone. But now we need to get the football to the end zone, the last 10 yards, in order to be able to get the touchdown that's out there. For those of you that are not up on American football, I apologize for that analogy. The key point here is essentially we've done a lot of the massive infrastructure off of here. It's much less effort in order to get faculty, subject matter experts that may be adopting, or students in other countries, in order to help move that bar from 90% to 100% in order to be able to facilitate the adoption. Plus, as I mentioned before, even at 95%, it's still a valuable resource for students in order to tap into, because there are no other OER content out there in the language in order to address what they want. There. So this is the last step that we're starting to proceed, is to establish a network in order to facilitate mass translation, mass human translation specifically, in order to augment this out there. And this is where we go back into what I was mentioning before, that the technology that we're using, that's based off of CX1 from NICE, is a wiki-based technology. It's the ideal technology for large-scale collaborative construction efforts, and it's essentially what we're talking about here. We want to facilitate large-scale collaborative construction efforts globally in order to be able to move this content forward. This is going to take a little bit of time, actually a lot of time, in order to establish and some resources in order to facilitate it, but we're very enthusiastic about where we're going with this and the impact of what we're planning on doing. So with that, I will end with what I started, which is our mission statement. We're implementing a community-built platform for the construction, curation, adoption, and adaptation of OER that's comprehensive and can be curated at multiple levels. I thank you for your time, and I'm willing to answer any questions that people may have. Thank you. No questions? Well, like I said, I'm very excited about what we've been doing here. I'm very excited about where we're going here. Anyone who has a book that's on the LibreText can request it to be translated into another language, and we can easily do that within the infrastructure that we've established.
I don't have any question here, Delmar, besides really, you know, pretty much the same comments of congratulating certainly the LibreText team for really working on this ecosystem, because I definitely am quite positive that this can be a game changer. Mainly when we look at, really, we've been on open education for a long time, that's meant 25 or so years. I mean, you seem to be addressing some key questions, really. And when it comes to accessibility, one of the main barrier, you know, being the language, and I think you share a graphic that spoke to it already, you know, having these mass translation, I think, you know, and using new technology to do it, going to open up huge opportunities for the, you know, other side of the world, really, the non-English speaking, you know, countries and so forth. So I am extremely excited. And as you know, I'm not waiting for anybody. I have already started creating my, Francophone community, touching to Francophone West Africa and France at the same time. So thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you. And we're happy to couple with any existing infrastructures out there in order to be able to scale this thing up. This capitalizes on many aspects of what has made us successful over the last 15 years. And we have great expectations for this in the future. I will mention that this machine translation effort that I presented here was predominantly focused around textbooks, but there are other aspects in the LibreVerse that could benefit also from the machine translation. For example, the homework infrastructure. So adapt can be converted into other languages, and we could do the translation that's involved in there in the same process. In fact, you can even argue that that's necessary, just like it's necessary in English languages, in countries where English is the primary language of use. So Siri asked a question. I'm not super knowledgeable with AI, but curious as to how or if it's being localized for languages in specific contexts. I guess I'm not entirely sure what you mean by specific contexts. Feel free to also use the audio. Oh, yeah. So the Amazon does have specific context for specific languages. There aren't a lot of them. I think French is one of them. Portuguese, they have both Brazilian and Portuguese. They have 3 to 4 different types of Chinese that's out there. So Amazon does have that capabilities. And I think the Google and the other big machine translation technologies have similar capabilities that they recognize. Now, I'm not in a position in order to evaluate the quality associated with that, but they do have a mechanism in order to facilitate that. One can argue that this could be a very useful technology for Canada when you have a need in order to be able to have content both in English and in French Canadian. Absolutely. Canadian French, sorry. Well, unless there are any other questions, I propose we close this thing out. I encourage you to take a look at some of the other presentations that we'll be doing later on this week. It's available the schedule's available at blog.libretext.org. And then I hope to see you in the future.
And how about the recordings?
The recordings will be posted on our YouTube channel very soon.
Okay.
It takes a while for us to be able to process that, especially when we have a very aggressive schedule like we have.
I know.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks.
Take care.
Bye.
So.